have the honor to welcome Professor Julian Go. It's such a great pleasure to start this decolonizing lectures with Julian, and to have the opportunity to hear during the next hour is wonderful and very inspiring and challenging work. I just say very briefly that Julian Go is a professor, as by now you know, because we have kind of a short bio online, and I would really recommend Googling and reading what Julian has wrote. It's very challenging for all of us, regardless of our disciplinary formative history. And Julian is a professor at sociology at the University of Chicago, where he has a number of important roles and positions. He's also serving as president of the Social Science History Association, among other a very filled career. And Julian has published very extensively about a number of issues regarding race, colonialism, history of the empires, sociology and postcolonialism, and a number of other important issues that we are all being challenged by today. He has won numerous prizes and awards for his books, just a few that are really very important, starting with The American Empire and the Politics of Meaning, Patterns of Empire, the British and American Empires, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. And more recently, Julian published a number of books on postcolonial thought and social theory, published with Oxford and in 2016, and other very important pieces of work, either books or papers. I will not be more descriptive about Julian's achievements. I would just recommend reading what he wrote so far. And having said that, now he's going to talk about a very important topic, anticolonial thought and the sociological imagination. And as Philippe was saying, it's kind of not just about sociology. It's important for us to start with sociology, but I think it's kind of a common endeavor that we are all on to kind of do a different type of social sciences and learn different methods of doing that. And I'm certain that we are all going to learn a lot today. Thank you, Julian, so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia and Felipe, for having me, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm really honored to be here. It's my first time in the University of Lisbon, and my first time in Lisbon, actually, and it's been great. I'm going to begin with a quote. The practice of imperialist rule demanded and still demands knowledge of the society it rules and of the historical reality in the middle of which it exists. In fact, man has never shown as much interest in knowing other men and other societies as during this century of imperialist domination. An unprecedented mass of information, of hypotheses and theories has been built up, notably in the fields of history, ethnology, ethnography, sociology, and culture concerning people or groups brought under imperialist domination. So yes, does anybody know who wrote this? Well, this comes from a man named Amilcar Cabral. Some of you may know him as the anti-colonial revolutionary who led the nationalist movements in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde that sought independence from Portugal. And in 1973, a year after the speech, he was assassinated. Now, two things interest me about this quote. The first is how this is really an early critique of imperialist knowledge. Cabral is pointing out how mainstream social science had been enlisted by colonialists and empires in order to help them rule. And I think Cabral prefigures, actually, Edward Said's critique of knowledge and empire. Second, Cabral comes to this critique of imperialist knowledge not as an academic thinker, but an activist amidst anti-colonial struggle. The anti-colonial movements of which he was a part entailed critical understandings of imperialism, and here Cabral is criticizing the epistemic aspects of imperialism, pointing out how social science is part of an imperial episteme, which not only supported colonialism, but sees the world and thinks about the world through its imperialist lens. And so with this critique, Cabral, I think, joins a distinct tradition and writing that is very different from mainstream social science as it was being developed in the centers of imperial metropoles, even here in Portugal. This tradition is the anti-colonial tradition, and this is the theme of my talk today. Not Cabral specifically, but more broadly anti-colonial thought. And more precisely, what I'm interested in is anti-colonial thought as an alternative to mainstream imperial social science, and hence anti-colonial thought as social thought. And I want to show how this is a critical and rich body of writing and thinking about society that we should recover and appreciate, even as dominant mainstream social science would not appreciate it and cover it up as something that is not really proper social science. And so my claim is that, as opposed to the sort of social science that was the object of Cabral's critique, that is, social science in the service of empire, anti-colonial thought might form the basis for an alternative social science interested in the service of emancipation rather than serving empire. So that's the larger argument of my talk today, but to get there, I will need to historicize a little bit. And here I want to just talk a little bit about sociology and social sciences generally, particularly in the country I'm familiar with, the United States, but also the history that I'm interested in would also touch British sociology, German social science, and French social science to a degree. I'm aware that social science and sociology in Portugal has a different history. Felipe has written a wonderful book about the history of sociology here in Portugal, and maybe he or others can tell me if the story that I tell of European sociology and US sociology in these other places is similar or not to the history of Portugal. But for the purposes of my talk, what I'm interested in is this history of sociology in the US, Britain, and maybe France and Germany. And in the United States or in Britain, when you tell the story about the origins of social science and sociology particularly, you hear that social science emerged in the late 19th century and the early 20th century as a response to industrialization and its problems. And that's the common story about the emergence of sociology. But of course, when we scope out and think about the broader historical context, what we're really talking about is empire. Now, this is a book in 1854 called Sociology for the South. It was by a man named George Fitzhugh in the United States. This was the first book with the word sociology in it in the United States. This book was a book that argues that slavery is justified on the basis that it maintains social order. This is just one of the many examples of the way in which sociology, when it first emerged, was done in the service of settler colonialism, in the service of colonialism, in the service of empire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when social science emerged as a discipline, and here we have some dates about the emergence of sociology in the United States and France and Britain. This is all happening around the late 19th century. This is when the discipline emerges, but it's also when imperialism is at its height. This is the number of colonies taken by European powers, and you see that exactly the time when disciplinary social sciences are emerging. This is the height of the number of acquisitions, of colonial acquisitions taken by European empires. And as Raymond Connell points out in an important work, this means that social sciences and sociology in particular, when it emerged, reflected the interests of these new imperial formations, manifesting the worldview of white male elites in the rising metropolitan centers of empire. And the questions that social science asked, the types of concerns and theories and concepts that social science dealt with reflected these interests and concerns of the imperial powers more broadly. From early social sciences anxieties about social disorder, its racialized lenses and attachment to social Darwinism, Weber or Durkheim's Orientalist lenses for discussing other cultures. In all of these respects and more, social science reflected the questions of interest to imperial centers and embedded the worldviews of these metropoles, thus expressing what I've called elsewhere the imperial standpoint. And of course, as the social sciences continued into the mid-20th century, it maintained much of this imperial standpoint. This is exactly what Cabral, in the quote I began with, was getting at, how social sciences reflected the interests and concerns of imperial powers. Now today, in 2023, is it 2023? It is. Sociology and social sciences are very different, of course. At least in the US and Britain and Germany and France. But I've argued elsewhere that there is still, in social sciences, embedded deep in the categories and concerns and questions it asks, there's still the imprint of this imperial legacy. This is seen in sociology's persistent essentialism, its analytic bifurcations, its metrocentrism, and the range of questions it typically asks. All of these reflect, I would argue, the fact that the social sciences have been reflective of imperial concerns and colonialist lenses. So I can talk more about those later, but suffice it here to say that the structure of the imperial episteme, I would argue, persists in many dominant sectors of social sciences today. And this raises the alternative history that I want to tell and gets us to the alternative type of social science that I want us to think harder about. And it has to do with anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. For as the British, European, and American empires in the 19th century spread and were consolidated around the world, and as imperial social sciences were consolidated and institutionalized, imperialism, of course, itself was long challenged and resisted. Colonized peoples nearly everywhere responded to European imperialism through various forms of resistance. And anti-colonial nationalist movements are reflective here. This is some data that my collaborator, Jake Watson, and I collected on the number of anti-colonial nationalist movements around the world, beginning in the 19th century up through the present. And you'll notice it's more or less a linear trend, but you see a big jump here, of course, after World War II, as the empires were challenged by their own infighting. This, of course, isn't the only form of anti-colonial resistance. Anti-colonial resistance took many forms. This is just the nationalist form. But I think it's indicative of the larger alternative story that I would have us think about, which is a story of resistance to empire. This form of resistance, of course, well, there was multiple types of resistance, but you see it in all kinds of Pan-African congresses that were meeting. I was just in Manchester where there was an important Pan-African Congress, and of course all the way up to the Bandung meeting of 1955, among many, many other modes of organization for anti-colonial nationalists. And what's of interest to me here is not just the fact of this anti-colonial resistance, but the ideational components to it. For with the proliferation of anti-colonialism also came new discourses and new ideas from colonized peoples. This was an anti-colonial discourse, critical of empires, critical of colonial capitalism, critical of racism, and it was part and parcel of larger anti-colonial projects that aimed to overthrow colonialism and its legacies. And I would argue that while this anti-colonial discourse was largely rooted in a political movement to overthrow colonialism, anti-colonial discourse also contained social thought, right? So while sociology and social theory was institutionalized in the metropole to reflect the imperial episteme, Anti-colonial thought was forming from the ground up in the dark underside of empire, and this body of thought offered different ways of thinking about, of theorizing, of understanding society that I suggest amount to a critical alternative sociology. Now, who were these anti-colonial thinkers? By my criteria, there are almost too many to name, certainly too many to count, and many of the writings and texts we will never be able to access. But let me just try to give you a bigger picture of what I mean when I talk about these anti-colonial thinkers. First, most of them were born in or lived in the colonies and drew upon their experiences there. These include everyone from, say, Jose Rizal in the Philippines, Eugenio Maria de Hostos in Puerto Rico, but it would also include later folks like, of course, Cabral and Nkrumah, Nguyen An Ninh from Vietnam, and of course César, Aimé César, and Suzanne César, and so on and so on. Many of these thinkers and activists were born in the colonies, but many were also educated in imperial capitals like Paris, London, or Barcelona, where anti-colonialists often met, mobilized, and theorized. Here are some great books by Goebel and some others on how Paris was a center for anti-colonial organizing, how London was a center for anti-colonial organizing. And of course, Amilcar Cabral had studied here in Lisbon, coming first in 1945 to be one of the few privileged African students. And Lisbon eventually became a center of anti-colonial organizing, not unlike Paris or London. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American sociologist, had visited and spoke in Lisbon in 1923. And by the 1950s, Lisbon had, and excuse my pronunciation here, the Casa dos Estudantes do Império, or the House for Students from the Empire. This is where Cabral and other African students began to develop an anti-colonial consciousness and read Pan-African magazines, like the French magazine Présence Africaine. By 1964, the Casa published its own version of the anti-colonial French journal Présence Africaine called Mensagen. Mensagen, yes. Other anti-colonial thinkers lived and operated within the internal colonies of metropolitan centers. I would include W.E.B. Du Bois as an anti-colonial thinker, even though he was born and raised in the United States. There are also folks like Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who was an indigenous activist born in the state of Wisconsin in the United States. And she and other indigenous thinkers represent an anti-colonial tradition that operated within the confines of settler colonialism in the metropole, living and fighting from within the internal colonized spaces of empire. The other point about these anti-colonial thinkers is that they emerged from a variety of social positions along a continuum of professionalization. Some anti-colonial thinkers were actual academics teaching in lower schools or universities, or they were researchers as part of colonial states. The list would here include Du Bois, of course, but it would also include the Indian sociologist Radhakmal Mukherjee, or the Algerian sociologist Abdelmalek Sayad, who was one of Pierre Bourdieu's collaborators, or the Lebanese theorist Mahdi Amel. And Cabral, of course, had been the manager of the agronomic center of Bissau, where he began the agricultural survey of Guinea. But many other colonial thinkers, and I'd say most others, were journalists or writers or artists. Others were activists and political leaders, everyone from Mabel Dove in the Gold Coast to Pedro Albizu Campos in Puerto Rico, and Nkrumah, and so on and so on and so on. The point is here is that these anti-colonial thinkers, when I talk about anti-colonial thinkers, it includes academics, might even include social scientists, but it also includes these activists, journalists, who were writing in very different forms than academic social science, right? And this is part of the challenge. While institutional social science would dismiss their thought as not social science because it wasn't academic, we have to surpass this limitation and read their writings and hear their words with an open sociological mind. And this gets exactly to my larger claim. Despite the fact that these thinkers were not card-carrying social scientists, or at least not all of them, they nonetheless offered up important ideas and social knowledges that imperial sociology either ignored or overlooked. They often offered innovative ideas about society and social relations that we might learn from. And I further want to claim that this was indeed a kind of social science that had potentially generalizable concepts and theories. And this is anti-colonial social thought then that on the one hand was talking about the dilemmas of colonized peoples in colonial societies. But on the other hand, in their anti-colonial thinking, they also offered up concepts and theories that could be transposable and generalizable, even for understanding social dynamics and social relations in the metropole. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to get us to do a reversal, right? Because for decades, sociological reasoning and practice has been dominated by what I call metrocentrism. We develop theories and concepts about society based upon the interests and concerns of the metropole, and then we apply them to the rest of the world. Marx developed his theory of capitalism by looking at the white male industrial worker in England, and then we applied that relation to the whole world. But what if we went the other way around, right? What if we reversed things? Rather than developing our categories, concepts, and problematics in, of, and for the metropole to then use for making sense of the rest of the world, what if we went in the other direction? So this is just to give some background on what I mean here and what my project is about. Let me now turn in the rest of my time to just some examples of some substantive sociological ideas and concepts that anti-colonial thought offers. The components, as it were, of what I like to think of as this alternative sociological imagination. And there's a lot, and I just want to run through a few examples. One is a set of ideas about what society is or how to theorize the social itself. This is a quote from a thinker. This was written in 1899. Society is an association of men who are together for mutual help so that each could enjoy the highest possible well-being, a situation that can never be arrived at by the sole efforts of individuals without the aid of others. This was written in a text by this man, Apolinario Mabini. He was in the Philippines. He had been part of the revolutionary government that sought to overthrow Spain and then fought against United States imperialism. And he helped set up the independent Philippine Republic. He, in fact, was one of the writers of the Constitution, the first Philippine Constitution. And he's known as the brains of that revolution. And so one of the things that is interesting here is that amidst all of these anti-colonial activities, Mabini bothers to theorize society. He theorizes it, as I said, an association of men who are together for mutual help. And what's interesting here, when you read the rest of his writings, you see that he's offering here a theory of society as essentially society as a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations. He talks about how mankind necessarily helps each other to survive, that to it all live in the world, we engage in reciprocal exchange and mutual help. Now, on some level, this language summons the exchange theories of the Scottish Enlightenment, such as those of Adam Smith, along with some versions of European social contract theory, and Mabini would have been familiar with those from his studies in law in Manila. But while Mabini appropriates some of these ideas, he merges them with Spanish Catholic ideas, and ultimately ends up with a different theory. While the Scottish Enlightenment was famously individualist and emphasized market exchange, for instance, Mabini theorizes mutual obligation as part of natural law that exists prior to and above individuals. More precisely, he claims that reciprocal obligations of society's members express the natural law of reason, or in Mabini's Spanish, razón, which also translates into the word right. And in Mabini's approach, society is not reducible to the market where self-interested individuals exchange material goods, nor in Mabini's theory does society emerge victorious from a Hobbesian state of nature, of anarchy, but rather is always already a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations seen as rights and maintained by reason. And again, Mabini comes at this idea amidst his anti-colonial struggle, and in fact, he uses this theory of society to vindicate the Philippine Revolution. He argues that foreign colonizers like Spain and then the US after Spain had transgressed natural law, had transgressed raison, because they were not reciprocal in their actions. They were taking and appropriating from the colonies, from the Philippines, but they weren't giving anything back. They weren't reciprocating. And for Mabini, this justified revolution. So while disciplinary sociology in the US at the time was emerging to justify imperialism, Mabini's social theory emerges at the same time to justify anti-imperial revolution. So that's just one approach that I think you can find. Another approach or way of thinking about society is very different, and it thinks about society as interdependent with the spiritual and natural world. And this comes largely from indigenous thinkers. When you read some anti-colonial indigenous thinkers, you see that they're dealing with a different problematic of domination. Where Mabini in the Philippines was dealing with a mercantilist, extractivist Spanish colonialism, indigenous peoples subjected to settler colonialism faced a very different type of colonialism. Rather than mercantilist extraction, they faced dispossession and displacement from the land. And this, I think, shaped their alternative conceptual approaches to society. And in these approaches, again, society is not so much a series of reciprocal exchanges between men, and it's more precisely a series of relations between humans, nature, and the spiritual world. And again, here I want to return to Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who again was this indigenous activist. And according to Kellogg, in her writings, she argues that Indian society before the intrusion of colonialism was very different than the Hobbesian state of nature or anarchy that Europeans thought it was. It was instead one where the red man was brother of the gods, living with beautiful watercourses in the great forests. She explains how the tribes or nations in which the red man lived aggregated into larger units, which were called the 5 nations of the Confederacy. And the different nations were not woven together by joint economic or political interests, but by the summoning of, by the eagle. Each nation is free unto itself like a free man, but when the eagle, which scans the heights and valleys over the home of nations, gives the cry, they are one heart, one head, one man. In Kellogg's conception, therefore, the unity of society is obtained through the command of the spirit's material manifestation in the natural realm. And so what's interesting here is that this is a view of society fundamentally different from European conceptions. European conceptions of society, and upon which entire social sciences are based, is based upon what? It's based upon separating human society from nature. This is a different notion of society where, in fact, human relations are fully embedded and dependent upon nature, and this is a kind of thick interdependence of elements that some environmental sociologists might today urge us to recognize, but which I think indigenous thinkers had already theorized and thought about. And in fact, indigenous thinkers like Kellogg were not alone. The writings of Radha Kamal Mukherjee are also really heading in this direction. He began writing in the early 20th century, and in his writings of the 1920s, he had landed upon what can be thought of as an ecological theory of the social. But unlike the social ecology of the early Chicago school and some anthropological ecologies of the time, Mukherjee's approach was much more critical and took nature more seriously. In one of his founding declarations, he argues that man and the region, which is his word for nature, are not separate but mutually interdependent entities, plastic, fluent, growing. And he opposes this conception of society directly to the so-called human ecological approach, the dominant one at the time going on in the US, for example, of which Mukherjee was very familiar. And he says that this dominant human ecological approach in the United States has been concerned almost entirely with biotic factors, with the effects of man upon man, disregarding the trees and animals, land and water. And so the intimate ecologic interrelations of man, but also his close alliance with the entire range of ecological forces and the use of water, the management of forests and rivers, or in the domestication of use and livestock. I mean, what he's really getting here is, again, this idea of society as fully embedded in nature. And Mukherjee actually goes on to criticize colonialism for thrusting weaker societies into a larger exploitative division of labor, prefiguring, I'd say, certain Latin American dependency theories later, whereby colonized societies are forced into a system of export monoculture, which he argues has devastating effects upon the environment. Labor is demoralized by the herding of masses of men recruited from the countryside into the plantation centers. Right, so he goes on to talk about how European imperialism not only thrust colonized societies into the periphery of the economic system, but did so in a way that was economically exploitative and ecologically exploitative and disastrous. So this, again, is getting at this idea of societies interdependent. The last view of society I want to briefly mention is society as racially compartmentalized, right? You get this, for example, quite clearly when you read Fanon. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Fanon, but let me just remind you about how he talked about Algerian society under French rule as fundamentally broken along racial lines. Fanon says that society is divided into these distinct worlds, a compartmentalized world. The dividing line, the border, is represented by the barracks and the police stations. The native sector is not complementary to the European sector. They are opposed, right? He goes on. The two confront each other, but not in the service of a higher unity. They follow dictates of mutual exclusion. And, you know, Fanon's writing about this as sociologists in the United States and in France at the time are thinking about society as an organic whole, right? Whether in the United States, and you're thinking about Parsons and his theory, structural functionalist theory of society as this interconnected, interdependent whole, or Durkheim, who sees all the different places in the division of labor as creating unity, right? Fanon here is suggesting society needs to be seen as fundamentally fractured along racial lines. And he continues throughout his writings to elaborate upon this idea of society and this racialized bifurcation. But Fanon was not alone. Cabral also wrote similar things when he was writing about what he called the social situation in Portuguese colonies in Africa. He described the social situation in Portuguese colonies in Africa as one of complete racial segregation, except for contact through work where it furthers the interests of colonialism, with very few exceptions, such as can also be found in South Africa. There is no social contact, and he talks about the experience of racism that Africans experience, right? Any African bold enough to enter one of these places must be prepared to face humiliation. And again, this is exactly at the time when sociologists in the United States and Europe are thinking about society as a social whole, when Durkheim is theorizing places, social spaces as places of unity and cohesion, right? Cabral is thinking of them as spaces of exclusion. That's a very different view of social space. So you have this very different notion of society, and we can go on to talk about the different view of social structure that these anti-colonial thinkers offered as well, complicating, say, the basic Marxist narrative of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat by, for example, talking about how the national bourgeoisie or the colonized bourgeoisie play this new role and the dilemmas that they face. Mabel Dove Dankwa, for instance, began her career as a journalist in Ghana during British rule and was an early advocate of anti-colonial feminism, and she initially supported Kwame and Nkrumah's nationalist mission, but she soon soured on the post-independence authoritarianism, masquerading as anti-colonial socialism, critiquing him and his gang as the comprador bourgeoisie, much to the detriment of the nation. And I won't read this, but you know, she's really here criticizing this new class that colonialism created. And at the same time, of course, giving us a complex picture of social structure in colonized societies that, again, you don't get from conventional sociologies talking about metropolitan societies. And so this is where, I want to stress, look, these colonial thinkers are talking about society as racially fragmented, as having this new complex social structure that colonialism created. And in this sense, of course, they're capturing important dimensions of social life in the colonies, which metropolitan theories ignored. But we must also think of these as potentially generalizable and applicable even to metropolitan societies, right? For example, Du Bois, he, like Fanon, theorized society as racially fractured. He said that society was fundamentally split by the color line and the veil of division. And of course, Du Bois meant this not just for post-slave societies like the United States, he meant it for all societies, and in fact, all of the world. His famous line is, "The color line belts the world." So this, again, is a global sociology, which for Du Bois is defined as a racially divided global society. And so again, I think that the anti-colonial thinkers are getting us to think about global society, not just colonized societies, not just the particularities of their own racial situation, but even metropolitan societies. And I think this is particularly interesting to think about as European societies increasingly see more and more immigration, more and more racial division. I think we can turn to people like Cabral and Fanon and Du Bois for making sense of these new social situations that pre-existing dominant sociology, whether it be Parsons or Durkheim, or even to some extent Marx, that maybe they're not fully capturing. So, a variety of sociologies and conceptions of the social. These are just examples. Let me just discuss a couple more before closing. I'm almost ready to close. There's so many different components of anti-colonial thought when you read it. I think there's so much going on. And I can't talk about all of them. I do want to briefly mention a few more. One is the self and social identity. I see these as theories of sort of colonial alienation, right? So if Durkheim talked about how modernity creates a situation of anomie, and Marx talked about alienation, folks like Du Bois, of course, talked about, and Fanon talked about double consciousness, or in Fanon's case, third-person consciousness. These are all about racialized alienation. Right? These follows from their theories of society as a racially fractured. If, according to Fanon and Du Bois, society is racially fractured in the ways they talked about, then this has a particular impact upon subjectivity, upon people's understandings of themselves, and it creates this unique sense of self, which is a tragic and unfortunate one. Again, Du Bois calls it double consciousness. Fanon here talks about it in terms of third-person consciousness. Suzanne Césaire, the Martinican anti-colonial surrealist and supporter of the Negrité movement, also adds to this how the social structures of racialized societies create not only distinct forms of subjectivity, but also existential dilemmas of social selfhood. In her 1942 essay, The Malaise of Civilization, she talks about the dilemma of Martinican identity and laments how colonialism has forced Martinicans into a subjectivity of dependence and cultural imitation. She thus rearticulates Freudian psychoanalytic categories to make sense of colonial subjectivity as a tragic condition striving to emulate European civilization and become white. She says the most serious thing is that the desire for imitation, just a short time earlier only a vaguely conscious one, since it was a defense mechanism against an oppressive society, has now migrated to the area of fearsome secret forces in the unconscious. And this dilemma, she notes, emerges exactly as a legacy of Haiti's racially segregated slave society, which outlawed any assimilation of black Haitians to white society through decrees instituting occupational segregation and even prohibited blacks from dressing the same as whites. And so this colonial structure generated a particular dilemma for black Haitians. One will understand from that point forward the fundamental goal of the colored man became assimilation. And with overwhelming force, a disastrous confusion takes place in his mind. Liberation means assimilation. Again, the particular social structure and the colonial situation and colonial legacies create particular existential dilemmas, particular notions of selfhood. We can also talk about social solidarity. I won't go in great detail here. I just thought that this discussion of solidarity is useful because in sociology, at least in the US, we read Durkheim in his theories of solidarity, but there's an alternative genealogy here. Jared Hawley, who's now at Edinburgh, has talked about this guy, Antenor Furman in Brazil, who offered a different notion of solidarity. He talks about it essentially as the basis for white racism, which is a very different way of thinking about solidarity than Durkheim does. This is La Solidaridad, the name of the Filipino elites, ilustrados as they were called, in writing in Spain and Barcelona in the late 19th century. And then Fanon, of course, talked about solidarity in a very different way than, say, Marx talked about consciousness. He says the necessary response to colonialism's tactical cleverness is a strategic solidarity amongst the territories occupied by French forces. Today we can measure the illusoriness of the famous doctrine according to which organic solidarity exists between the proletariat of colonialist countries and that of colonized peoples. In actual fact, the theory of anti-colonialism is being formulated today, and all the theses previously put forward have proven entirely false. Colonized peoples must essentially count on their colonized brothers. He's, of course, critiquing Marxist assumptions that class forms the basis for solidarity. And Fanon and contemporaries like César argued that these assumptions, of course, overlook racial division, and Fanon sees solidarity as group unity beyond class, beyond race, in fact, and in fact beyond the nation, extending to all colonized peoples. And solidarity here then is theorized by people like Fanon, by Furman, not as a natural product of the division of labor, which is what Marx and Durkheim argued, but rather as something created through struggle against an other, right? Political struggles against oppression generate solidarity. Opposition generates unity of identity and feelings of connectedness. This was, of course, one of the main themes of Amilcar Cabral's work as well. His word for solidarity, though, was unity. I don't know what the Portuguese translation would be. But he spent a lot of time talking about unity as forged through struggle. Right? Again, very different notions of solidarity and unity. Finally, my last point. These anti-colonial thinkers, of course, offered us a lot to say and think about when it comes to revolution, right? Now, conventional social science has long written about and theorized revolution. Particularly in the United States, you had a lot of work beginning in the 80s and 90s, coming out of the 60s, to theorize and think about revolution. Most of that work have been about the French Revolution, right, rather than anti-colonial revolution. And they've been typically aimed at trying to explain why revolutions happened, almost as if there's an anxiety about them happening again. Anti-colonial thinkers like Cabral, Fanon, or Mabini, or some of the other folks I'm talking about, also tried to explain why revolutions happen, but they went deeper to explore the meanings of revolution, the importance of revolutionary action, the role of the peasantry in revolutions, transnational or cross-colonial solidarities and alliances, who the leaders of these movements should be. Can they come from the masses, or should they come from the peasantry, or should they be sort of organic intellectuals, as Gramsci talked about them, right? And unlike conventional sociology, they also thought hard about the post-revolutionary period and how to build more just societies. Fanon, for instance, envisioned what I would call a post-colonial cosmopolitanism that imagined a post-colonial world not of nation-states, but of global humanity. And so this sort of post-colonial imaginary, to conclude, is just one of the many things I think that we can gain from anti-colonial thought. As I've tried to argue, these anti-colonial movements of the 19th and 20th centuries offer us a rich panoply of ideas that amount to, taken together, I think, an alternative critical sociology. And I've tried to excavate some of these ideas here, not to end the project, but to open it up, and to urge all of us to take anti-colonial thought more seriously as the basis for an alternative critical sociology that, rather than serving empire, might instead be enlisted for critiquing empire and for ultimately generating emancipatory knowledge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Julian, for this inspiring talk. And now we have time for questions. as you said it very well, you opened up a debate that can be very challenging. So I would open the debate to a couple of questions. I don't know if you want to just let's open up. I don't know if anyone has kind of doubts, questions.
I have questions.
Well,
do we want to? Maybe we can take it from Zoom too, if you want.
Yes.
Or I have to get back to this. I don't know if you can.
And yes, on Zoom, please, if you want to speak, or maybe you can write down the questions if it's easier, and we can pick up a few questions, and then we still have time.
But Felipe wants to start, yeah?
No.
Okay, there's not. Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think it's very important that we really change the way sociology, the history of sociology is addressed. When I enter into sociology, and usually the word colonial is completely absent, especially from courses on social theories.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important that we try to change this canon in how things are really processed. So thank you so much. And I think this is clearly an important contribution and reflection. I have one more number of questions, but I'll just ask one more, say more pragmatic or straightforward one, which is about the way you are chronologically framing your study. Why you start in the 19th century? Why you end in the 20th century? Why are you bundling all these guys together?
Yeah.
You know, you jump from Cabral to the Filipino in the 19th century, and then again you jump again, go to Fanon, and then you go backwards, back and forwards in this place. What difference it makes for a historian, someone trained as a historian? This is a bit sometimes pushing a bit.
It's a big no-no.
Yeah, well, so I want to know how you address this. I can understand you are trying to extract or abstract some concepts that relate to more of thought and theory, but again, it's also a matter of kind of intellectual history you want to do, and how you deal with place and time, basically. Do all these movements to extrapolate these things.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. You're urging me to think harder about my methodology, which I haven't thought too seriously about, so I appreciate you forcing me to think about methodology. So two things. I am picking this 19th century, 20th century, partly because, well, for two reasons. One, because this is when the disciplinary social sciences emerge, and so I'm thinking about the alternative, right? So there's partly that. There's also, I think, maybe this is just a personal interest, but the period of high imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, up through the major anti-colonial struggles, I just think that these are really important historical moments that get us close to the present as possible. I have a colleague in history at the University of Chicago who's an early modern theorist of the British Empire, and he's constantly trying to get me to think about the 16th century. That's just not my thing. It's colored a personal preference, but I also think that these are recent anti-colonial movements that are very relevant for us today. And also, again, given that the social sciences is new, right? The social sciences as we know them are new. So that's why I focus on that period. Now, about this going to all these different places, that is definitely deliberate. One of the things I'm trying to do is to see if, like, as a hypothesis, when you read about, and you read the works of so many different anti-colonialists in all these different places, can you find shared problematics? Can you find shared concerns? Can you find generalizable? Well, that's for me a way to get at more generalizable concepts. And so I really, I don't want to do, a deep dive into any particular thinker. I know there's problems with that, but I want to get a sense of the whole tradition. I want to see if we can create a global tradition, because anti-colonialism itself was global, I would argue, because colonialism was also global and empires was global. So it's an experiment to see if I could find similarities. And so, I do try to go from, Fanon and César in the French Empire to the Philippines and to, the Spanish Empire and to different empires to see, again, of course, immense differences in both the struggles and the empires involved. But what's interesting is to find shared problematics. And I just think that's really important to match the global shared I do think there's a shared level in which we can say that colonized peoples don't have the same struggles, but there are some basic underlying shared struggles that I'm interested in. Yeah.
Maybe I can actually have a follow-up question, methodological, with 3 dimensions. One has to do with what we call the component of social thought, the theme, and another one has to do with the position these authors occupy, and the third has to do with the form in which they write. Okay, the form vis-a-vis the content, so the dialectic from the content. So regarding the theme, looking at your themes, the self, solidarity, so on, they seem quite conventional. See what sociology 101 kind of thing. What if we, for a moment, think about a different thing? And going back to Cabral, the soil. Because he's after all an agronomist.
Yeah.
He studies the soil in Alentejo and then in Guiné, so on. What about the soil? The soil as a metaphor, as a physical reality, but also as a socio-economic reality. Position. As you well described in your talk, you are talking about some authors who are, as you call it, card-carrying sociologists, but also people who are journalists and activists, and of course political leaders. So what is the position these people occupy? Perhaps, again, the notion of, say, the philosopher King, in certain cases actually applies, not in others. But what is the position, this production of knowledge that you are that they occupy? And of course, the third one is that I was suggesting the question of the form. Again, in your paper, you talk about enough. You haven't read about the importance of the way the form these writers occupy. In other words, say they are not writing journal articles. They are not writing treatises. They are doing something else. And oftentimes it is about writing an essay. And the essay form, I guess, it's very typical and again very illustrative of what these people are doing, precisely because of the position they occupy, and of course because some of the themes they are concerned with are not sociological, Durkheimian or neo-Durkheimian themes. Those are the three.
Thank you. Very, very great questions. So first on the theme, I definitely agree. You know, going back to Cabral, and that's one of the things that reading Cabral again, the soil, and you know, I consider this to be part of I think the anti-colonialist interest in the land and the environment more broadly. I think that's a theme. So you know, that would be a theme that I think is important and that I think should be researched more. I subsume it under the theme of the social, which is the conventional. But I think, because I think that's what's so interesting about it, is that they are not thinking about the soil in and of itself, right? Or land. It's about humans' relation with, it's part of the social. So, you know, that's where the sociological comes in. But I definitely think that that's a theme that should be explored. And yes, the self, identity, all these other themes, they're very traditional sociological concerns. I account for those in two ways. One, you know, there is a sense in which I'm trying to provide a contrast on the same themes, right? So I want to show that these thinkers are thinking about similar things to what conventional sociology would look at, but they're thinking about those same things very differently. So that's part of it. But the other part of it, and this probably gets to the other 2 points, the other part of it comes from, I think they are thinking about these things because at least the anti-colonial sociologists or social thinkers that I've been exploring, their social position is exactly of a kind of mediator. They are engaging with sort of the colonizers' ideas, and they're trying to toy with them in different ways and appropriate them and use them. So this isn't, you know, this is not an attempt to dig into sort of purely subaltern subjectivities or epistemologies of the South. It's a different project. These are intellectuals who are in conversation with and engaging with the colonizers directly and often inspired by, you know, Marx or whoever, but also trying to use them and localize them and also offer new things. And so you will find, I think, similar themes because they're engaging in this. That's how I would explain their position, right? A lot of them, of course, come to Lisbon and they study in France. And so they are fully engaged. And I think of these as kind of mediators with a certain amount of class privilege, of course, but intellectually they are mediators. So this is not a project in trying to find some kind of non-European social theory. And this is a real difference that I have from other attempts to do kind of Southern theory or Farid Alatas in Singapore. Wonderful work on what he calls non-Western discourses. I don't consider this non-Western. That's not the project. These are fully engaged with so-called Western discourses, and they are very interesting in that sense. Finally, for the form, yeah, the essay form, I think it's mostly essays, it's political tracts as well. And you know, when we teach Marx in the United States, we often, besides Capital, we also teach Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. Which is what? It's a political pamphlet. And we are trying to get them to read this political pamphlet for its sociology in it, right? That's what I constantly say. Look, this is a pamphlet. You can historicize it. You can think about it in this particular way. But let's read the sociology in it. What is he saying about class structure? What are they saying about history? Well, I'm trying to do the same thing with these anti-colonial essays, right? Their versions of the Communist Manifesto, which, again, aren't sociologies. They're not academic. But that doesn't mean there aren't sociologies in them. Yeah. So I think the form is a very good question. You know, I haven't thought about how the form, the dialectic of form and content plays out. I'll have to think about that more, but that's a very important point that I need to think about.
Well, more questions? Oh, and online? That, maybe you can see Julian.
Okay, so the question is, my question is about the notion of emancipatory knowledge. Can you elaborate what you mean by that? How would you connect it with the calls for developing normative models of the social? Okay. Yes. This gets at my vision of social science and what I think social science is about. I am an interminable, hopeless social scientist, social realist, let's put it that way. And that I believe that there's a real world that exists outside our minds. I believe that world is constructed socially. I believe that we can access that world through analysis. And I believe that there are patterns and logics in that world. And social science is about detecting, theorizing, analyzing, understanding those patterns and logics, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, both an anti-colonialist and one of the first sociologists, did this wonderfully. And what he was able to do was to use social science, the tools of social science, ethnography, studying Philadelphia African Americans, statistics even, all in the service of what? Of finding out and showing that race was a social construction, that the poverty and experience and the low position of African Americans was not caused by their racial inferiority, which was the dominant claim at the time, right? The claim that, these black Philadelphians are poor and have poor health because of their genetic inferiority. That's what even the sociologists at the University of Chicago were saying. But what Du Bois did was use social science to show that they're wrong, to show that this is actually a social construction and that racial inferiority is not biologically produced, but socially produced. And he did this using, I would argue, the tools of social science. And I think that's what social science should do. I think it should analyze patterns and logics in the world in order to expose lies and speak truth to power. And that's what I mean about emancipatory knowledge. Knowledge that accesses the real and real logics and patterns about domination and power and exploitation, and that exposes lies about those that are told all the time by voters and by officials and by powers that be. And that social science can be critical in that way by exposing those lies, and that we can use the tools of social science for that. That's what I mean by emancipatory. I mean knowledge that speaks truth to power. And so that's where I am. Again, I'm not searching for, when I say alternative sociologies, I'm not searching for alternative epistemologies. I'm searching for different kinds of theories and concepts and asking certain kinds of questions that help us better get at those patterns and logics of domination and exploitation, because I think that dominant social science too often doesn't explore those properly. So that's what I mean by emancipatory. I think of it as emancipatory and critical at once, and maybe I think of those terms interchangeably. I hope that answers something of that.
Yeah, I have a question that's trying to engage something that Ricardo already talked, and how to cross this different experience of living. And they use this experience as a Gramish way to talk about society. Mm-hmm. But I also would like to hear about your thoughts about the changes between written words and to become and to pick up in arms, in guns, to fight against the domination. Mm-hmm. And how can we cross these ideas, especially with the North Americans' emancipatory ideas that doesn't necessarily change from words to guns or to fight against the domination, and these South intellectuals that have this revolution as a main concern with their words, and how then we can connect these ideas that produce practice, actions in the real world. So just
yeah. How can we connect the ideas of these anti-colonial thinkers with practice? Is that one way to think about it? Yeah. You know, that's an interesting question. I think that some of the anti-colonial thinkers are revolutionaries, Cabral, Fanon, and they are really writing amidst revolution. Others are anti-colonial revolutionaries, but they're not in the heat of the revolution. They are trying to create movements, for example. So I think W.E.B. Du Bois and some of these other thinkers are more in the beginning state. They're trying to create movements, whereas Fanon and Cabral are in the middle of movements. So I think the answer to that question is not going to be singular. I think that depending upon the texts that we're reading, the context in which they're being written, then we have to think about what lessons they teach us for that particular moment of struggle, right? So for Fanon and Cabral, I think thinking about the concrete specificities or interests and concerns about actual ongoing revolution, they're going to be very useful for that. But somebody like Du Bois or Mabel Dove who are writing not in an exact revolutionary situation, but are fighting against forms of oppression in different ways, they're going to have different ideas. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a singular answer to that. I think it depends upon the particular kinds of texts we're looking at. And hopefully we can maintain, on the one hand, a sense that these anti-colonial thinkers all share certain things and share certain ideas, but also they're also involved in different parts of struggle in different moments, and there are also differences that we have to respect.
Oh, there's another question.
That's me? So, sorry, I'm not a sociology student, so if I'm a bit confused, just correct me, but here it goes. The empires you mentioned that legitimized the traditional way of sociology have particularly diminished. But you seem to focus a particular mechanism that it kept in its roots, rather the meta-history of sociology itself. So first of all, a bit of a personal question. When you teach sociology, do you mention these names as elementary, as Durkheim? Mm-hmm. And second, what can we do to social science in general to focus right now, the focuses we study right now, taken from these other perspectives?
Oh, very good question. So yes, I teach most of these folks. I teach them in a very different way. I teach them as examples of a particular imperial mindset. I don't discount the ideas on those grounds. I just ask the students to understand the ideas and to understand where they're coming from and the context of them, right? So I do tend to treat them as somewhat historical and specific, right? So when I teach Marx, I don't teach Marx as a theorist of global capitalism necessarily. I teach him as offering a particular view of capitalism that comes from England, a particular moment in English capitalist history that may be helpful for thinking about global capitalism, but that definitely needs supplement other viewpoints. So then I have them read Black Marxists, I have them read C.L.R. James to get a look what happens when you think about capitalism from the plantation. Right? Similarly, with Durkheim on solidarity, I will teach the students solidarity, and I think it's an important kind of set of concepts, but I also historicize Durkheim, contextualize him, and I also try to offer other ways of thinking about solidarity by using some of these other thinkers. So I'm really trying to proliferate, right? And that does mean spending a little bit less time on those classic thinkers, much less time than some of my colleagues, older colleagues would like. But you know, hey, I'm full professor now. I do what I want, and I think that that's what we should do. So does that help get at some of the questions? Yeah.
So
yeah.
we would argue that for universities, let's say in Portugal, to have an anti-colonial mindset is to have more classes on others, or on those thinkers, or is it necessary to go beyond that?
Oh.
You know, structure social inquiry differently.
Oh, okay.
Because they're not this kind, they're not very.
No, I think that given the institution, well, I don't know, I can't speak about here.
Just pick another country.
But I think, yeah, I'll pick mine. I think that there are institutional realities in which education happens, and that I try to work with those confines. So I will fight to the death in my faculty meetings to make sure that Fanon is on the syllabus that every freshman has to read, and I think that's a battle worth fighting. Other people have different battles, but that's the short-term, immediate battle that I think is worth fighting. And we can also think about creating alternative knowledge centers, alternative ways of organizing knowledge, but working still, for me, within the confines of my profession, which is to teach sociology and to find the battles within the university that I can actually impact. And this is part of that larger battle, right? So, yeah, that's really the type of challenge that I've taken on, is to expand the curriculum, expand what we teach, expand what my students research, and how students think about the world. That's, I think, the most I can do, and that's big enough.
More questions? I guess.
Another question above, okay, yeah. Oh, another question above, okay.
Yes, and then I have also a question about the
Okay, yes, I'll try to repeat the questions on Zoom. I'm sorry, we've been neglecting you all. I'm very sorry. Julian, thank you for your presentation, for your project. I think it would be great if you could include the work of the Angolan sociologist Maria Pinto. Yes, de Andrade. Yes, okay. You studied sociology. Ah, okay. Yes. Oh, you want to speak? Can we let them speak? Yeah.
we can try. Let's see.
I don't know how to. Yes, Claudia Costello, do you want to speak?
Okay, thank you for your talk. There's a lot of knowledge, fortunately, on Amilcar Cabral, but I think that Mário Pinto Andrade should not be disregarded. He published articles in Portuguese and in French, but also in English in the crisis. And recently, Mário Costa from Wisconsin University, I suppose, translated into English one of Mário Pinto Andrade articles. Okay. He was also, passed also through the Casa dos Estudantes do Império, and he was one of the founders of the Centro de Estudos Africano with Amilcar Cabral. Is from Cabral's generation, and is an important sociologist for your project. Well, it's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. I'll take that. And you know, this is where I think of this as a collective effort. There's no way any single individual can explore all these thinkers. I don't read Portuguese, so there's only so much I can do. But some of you read Portuguese, some of you read German and French, and so I really am hoping that that the kind of work I'm doing in some small way warrants and gets maybe some others to maybe take a look at some thinkers that they hadn't thought about as sociologists. So this is a perfect example, and thank you for that suggestion. And I will definitely look at Costa's translation of Andrade. Thank you.
Well, more questions? Well, I have something that I would like also to ask you, since I thank you for you already explained a lot, but one thing I found very interesting. You mentioned briefly that your project for sociology, or it could be one of the other social sciences, is a method also, I think, of looking at things from an anti-colonial perspective. But then again, the anti-colonial can be maybe too large or sometimes too narrow. It's also a concept.
Yeah.
How would you define it in ways that we can relate to that? How can we know, for instance, operating with what you are proposing, how can we know we are adding, for instance, another writer, another intellectual, another author? How can we know that it's kind of that can be part of an anti-colonial way of doing social sciences or sociology? And you are saying that your project is different, and I can understand that from Southern theory or post-colonialism or post-colonial theory or decolonial theory. But can you explain that a bit more? Because I think this methodological way, how can we work with that? It's very important.
Yes. Thank you. So, okay. So first of all, I think of my project. I don't think it's mine. It's there are variations of this, but my particular attempt to recover anti-colonial thought as social theory, I see that as part of post-colonial social thought. And post-colonial doesn't mean that colonialism is over. It means post-colonial thought in that it is theory or thought that tries to escape the confines and legacies that colonialism has bequeathed upon social thought. So it's post-colonial in the sense of trying to look towards ways of social thinking and social thought that don't fall prey to the limitations of colonialist social science. So I think of anti-colonial sociology or anti-colonial social thought as part of that larger project, and I'm happy to exchange anti-colonial versus post-colonial. I'm happy to exchange those terms. I think that might be different from the decolonial project, which depends on who you're talking about and what the lineages are. But of course, there's Minolo and the decolonial project, which is just different from mine because I think it's I'm firmly a sociologist, and I'm not sure that the decolonial project is that disciplinary and social scientific. I have yet to read their epistemology and philosophy of social science. It's a broader project. It's grander than I could ever do. It's seeking alternative methodologies, alternative epistemes, completely different ways of knowing that go against what they often refer to as Western ways of knowing. And this is where, again, I claim my heritage as a Western social scientist. And so I think that's a difference. I think that at least much of what I've read from some of those decolonial thinkers, they would have to reject my project as too social scientific. That's fine. They're doing something bigger. To some, maybe better. I'm doing my own project, which is very much rooted in social science. I think that's a crucial difference. So the other question about anti-colonial, this is a historically specific thing I'm looking at. We are in the year 2023. I think that we're still living with the legacies of modern colonialism, by which I mean the direct domination and political domination and appropriation of sovereignty and exploitation of peoples through direct rule, beginning as far back as the 15th century up through the present, which really only ends, even for Portugal, in the 1970s, right? So this is a recent phenomenon. And so anti-colonial, I'm thinking about it in the confines of that particular formation. So thinkers who have criticized and tried to critique, struggle against all the different aspects of that colonial formation, the political and economic aspects, and it includes a lot, right? It's not just the political form of domination, although that's what a lot of these writers are interested in. It also includes capitalism and the particular forms of capitalism that arose with colonialism. So I think this is where we have to really understand our history better and understand both colonialism historically and its legacies in the present, and understand these anti-colonial movements. And I learned so much from historians working on anti-colonial movements and thinkers, and completely dependent upon them. And I think that hopefully they can continue to produce great work on anti-colonialism that can enrich and nourish the kind of project that I want to do.
Well, that was an excellent clarification.
That looks like it.
Okay.
I'm wondering what the interactions were, if any, between these anti-colonial thinkers and texts and the canon of sociologists. We know it, we have talked for a century or so. I mean, any trace of anti-colonial, what are the interactions? You mentioned Weber relating to somehow some of the thinkers. Do we find connections, or this is completely separate? You see?
Yeah.
Could they go separate, or can you bring them, make connections, interactions, even think whether or not anti-colonial thinkers like those you're following and an impact on even a reactive impact on how the social sciences and social theory as we know it at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, that's a great question for intellectual historians. The answer for the folks I'm talking about, it depends upon who you're talking about. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, interacted with Weber. One could argue that Weber learned a lot from Du Bois. One could argue that the Chicago School of Sociology, which was a set of thinkers in the early 20th century, actually stole from Du Bois. And then it goes to people like Rajgopal Mukherjee, who in the 20s was actually corresponding with American sociologists and American anthropologists. And so some of them are really part of their dialogue. We're just now beginning to see how maybe, say in this case, American sociology is being inspired and influenced by them. And I have one of my students working on Mukherjee and his impact on some of the American thinkers. And of course we know that people like Fanon was interacting with Sartre, and we know that Bourdieu was reading Fanon and familiar with Fanon. We know that Bourdieu was working with Sayad, and that Sayad and Bourdieu in Algeria created a lot of interesting work together, and we still don't know to what extent Bourdieu was inspired by the local collaborators he was working with, who often get forgotten. So these are intellectual histories that need to be done, and we're only just now beginning to explore them.
Well, thank you. Julian, this was an excellent, I don't know if online anyone wants to ask a question, but I think it's kind of, we have a long period of question and answers. Maybe we can wrap it up with, and just thank you so much for this wonderful talk and great afternoon. It was really fantastic, and we hope to have you again.